Hi, I'm Mike Ray. The release of the Warren Report on the assassination of President Kennedy in September of 1964 was met by nearly universal acceptance both in the political arena and the Fifth Estate. However, as people began to read the report, questions came to the forefront. Shortly thereafter, the first crack in the Warren Report came from the hands of one individual. His name? Harold Weisberg. That hammer that caused the first crack was his book, Whitewash. This book caused a reverberation that is still being felt today. And the manuscript gave courage to individuals everywhere to look into the case once more, but this time with a more critical eye. Weisberg, a one-time Senate investigator, intelligence and political analyst, is the author of 6 books on the Kennedy assassination and 1 book on the murder of Martin Luther King. A confidential relationship began between Weisberg and Senator Richard Russell of the Warren Commission. Russell had doubted parts of the Warren Report and encouraged Weisberg to disprove it. After he gave Russell proof of how he had been deceived and a record of his doubts destroyed, Russell resigned his senatorial CIA oversight responsibilities and broke his long friendship with President Johnson. On July 31, 1991, Mr. Weisberg granted me an extensive interview relating to 3 documents that he had uncovered through the Freedom of Information Act. These documents tell of the U.S. government's beginning involvement in the cover-up of the assassination. The 78-year-old Weisberg talked to me from his home in Frederick, Maryland.
What we're talking about really is the investigation of the assassination of a president and whether or not the crime itself was a conspiracy. I think that listeners may not understand what a conspiracy is under the law. It means a combination to do anything the law says is wrong, plus an effort to implement it, to carry it forward, to remove it from the area of protected free speech. I think that without any question, there was a conspiracy to kill the president, and that as a result of the fact that the crime itself was never investigated officially and was never intended to be officially investigated, there are no leads to follow, and that as a result of what in my first book I called the whitewash, and my second, and that dates to 65, and my 1966 book I called the cover-up. In fact, it does protect those who killed the president. Now, the first of these records that I used last night, let me also say that because of, I'm going back a little bit, because of the actuality of the fact that the crime was never officially investigated, there really are no legitimate leads for private investigators to follow. As a result, and including their own irresponsibility, we've had a proliferation of the wildest and, in every case, unproven conspiracy theories. My belief is that these deceive and mislead the people, that the people are entitled to know the truth, and that while there's nothing wrong with conjecturing, and nothing wrong with writing a book in which you say you're conjecturing, it's very wrong to tell the people that what is a conjecture, and most often has no basis in fact at all, is the truth, is the fact. And that's by objection to the books and the other forms in which these theories are advanced. Now, the first record I referred to is dated November 22nd, 1963. It's a Dallas FBI record. I should inform your listeners that I filed perhaps a dozen Freedom of Information lawsuits, and as a result, on this and other assassinations, I got about 1/3 pages of records, mostly from the FBI, and about 250,000 of them relate to the John Kennedy assassination investigation. And at one time, they had a crew of 6 civil division lawyers assigned to frustrating my Freedom of Information lawsuits. And they openly called themselves, among themselves, the Get Weisberg crew.
And they failed in their job.
Yeah, well, the time they failed was when they were forced to give me the records they were going to disclose without charge. That frustrated them even more. But that one time I had a decent judge. Now, on November 22nd, at a time not specified, but clearly early in the day, the Dallas field office got a telephone call from a sergeant in a nearby police department. It was taken by an investigative clerk named Robert G. Renfro, and he wrote a memorandum on it. The memorandum is from the main assassination file in Dallas. That number is 8943. And he says that this Sergeant Sherrill had said, quote, Jimmy George Robinson and members of the National States Rights Party should be considered possible suspects in the assassination of President Kennedy due to their strong feeling against him. That's all I'll quote from this short record. The fact is that there were several known threats against John Kennedy by the National States Rights Party, a small right-wing group. Now, this record has a notation on it referring to certain 3x5 cards kept in the Dallas office, plus 6 different Dallas office files relating to Robinson and the National States Rights Party. One is a civil rights file, 2 are subversive files, and 1 is a racial matter file. In the processing of records, the FBI field offices have stamps that they use at the bottom with blanks for it to be filled in, showing when the records were searched, when they were indexed, when they were serialized, and when they were filed. This one was filed November 22nd, 1963. But the stamp says so. And that was before Oswald was charged, remember. He wasn't charged until the next day. Well, what did the FBI in Dallas do with this lead? This is what is written on the bottom of it. Not necessary to cover as true subject located. How did they know? They seem not to have known Oswald's name, by the way. How did they know, before Oswald was even charged, that he was the, quote, true subject, close quote? How did they know that even if he were the so-called true subject, he was all alone? Obviously, they couldn't know either of these things or the other many questions raised by this.
Makes you wonder.
Yes, it does. Now, I'm not suggesting that Dallas got a telephone call from Washington FBI headquarters saying, cover it up. I don't think that happened. I think that's just the way they work. Now, on the next day, November 23rd, I have this memo from the headquarters main assassination file, the number of which is 62109-060, and this is serial number 453 in it. It's on the subject of the assassination. It's by Carter DeLoach, who was the assistant director of the FBI in charge of what they call crime records, but he was really in charge of lobbying and propaganda and leaking and things of that sort. And the record was sent through channels to J. Edgar Hoover. I never saw any top official of the FBI write a memo addressed to J. Edgar Hoover personally. It all went through channels, and if they were up high enough, it went to the man next to Hoover. But this record of the 23rd reports that the special agent in charge of the Dallas office, Gordon Shanklin, quotes, stated he believed that Zapruder had later offered a copy of his film to us. Abraham Zapruder took the most famous amateur motion picture film of the Kennedy assassination. It shows that the crime was committed within 5.6 seconds, and it shows when the president was hit, when he, and things of that sort, in the position of people in the body. And it was used by the FBI and by the commission as a timing device. Well, there's another sentence in this letter I'll read you. Shanklin stated he did not believe this film would be of any evidentiary value. How could anybody of any rank, high or low in the FBI, believe that a picture of the president being killed would have no evidentiary value at all? But the FBI, this is what they said. Now, I'm going to, still staying and going back to Dallas. Monday the 25th was the first working day after the assassination, and on that morning, Walter Bent, sales manager of the Eastman Kodak Company Processing Division, phoned the FBI Dallas office, and he spoke to Special Agent Milton L. Newsom. He wrote this and another report on it from the same 8943 file, this one serial 518. And he reports that Charles Bronson, an engineer, had taken pictures with an 8mm camera and a 35mm camera, in which he thought he saw he got the picture of the president being killed and a picture of the building from which the FBI said the shots were fired. So then Newsom got hold of another agent named Emery Horton, and the two of them went to Eastman Kodak, and they looked at the pictures. They said, they're worthless. They didn't take them. This is his second memo of November 25th, from which I'll read in part. Films taken by Mr. Bronson at the time of the president's assassination including 35mm color slides, which were taken with a Leica camera, and an 8mm Kodachrome film were reviewed. These films failed to show the building from which the shots were fired. Film did depict the president's car at the precise time shots were fired. However, the pictures were not sufficiently clear for identification purposes, close quote. If the picture showed the president's car at the precise time the shots were fired, they showed the president being killed. What else does it take for them to have real value, real importance? What does he mean when he says not sufficiently clear for identification purposes when it actually shows the president being killed? What he immediately means is if it doesn't show Oswald with the smoking gun, we don't want it. Now, I've seen that picture. Let me explain to your audience that after I got these records, in the lawsuit in federal district court in Washington, the number of which was 780322, friends of mine in Dallas and Fort Worth got copies and went out and found Bronson and looked at his pictures. Bronson was very cooperative. And as a matter of fact, one of these men was an investigative reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, and it had a big Sunday edition on these pictures in which they printed on the front page the picture of the president being killed. It's a very clear picture. And with regard to not being able to use it for identification purposes, in fact, it could be used to identify a lot of things and a lot of people. People who were witnesses and were clearly shown in the background, even the positions of the bodies of the victims and others in the presidential car. Now, as to its not showing the building, he's talking about the 8mm film there. In truth, it shows 87 different frames, that is 87 different pictures of the very window in that building in which it was alleged Oswald was the assassin. It also shows nobody in it, only seconds before the shots were fired. Now, this record, like the investigative report, the lead report filed by investigative clerk Renfrew, were never sent to Washington by the FBI Dallas office, incredible as that may seem. Nobody in Washington knew about it until they got copies of the records that were compelled to give me by the lawsuit I referred to. Now, the record I'm going to read from now is dated November 25th, 1963. That's Monday. It's the first working day after the assassination. It's addressed to Bill Moyers, who was then the proper channel for the man who wrote this to use in reaching Lyndon Johnson. The man who wrote it is Nicholas Katzenbach. He was then Deputy Attorney General of the United States. That's the number 2 man. And with Bobby Kennedy not there, he was in addition the Acting Attorney General. This record is from the Department of Justice file 12911, and it has the initials of Howard P. Willens, who was, in fact, loaned to the Warren Commission by the Department of Justice, where he was the number 3 lawyer. I won't read the entire memo, but it begins by telling Moyers that certain things are important. And number 1, and he numbered them. Number 1, the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have any Confederates who are still at large, and that the evidence was such he would have been convicted at trial, close quotes. How in the world did anybody in the world know that? Nobody knew it. It wasn't true.
Well, now, the FBI didn't investigate the crime. This is a completely different situation. You have the FBI on one hand, you have Deputy Attorney General concurring or going along with this idea. Were they in cahoots with each other, that they were not going to touch this thing and just let Oswald be the person?
I don't think they had to be in cahoots. I think that's just the way the bureaucracy works. The first law, as many FBI agents have told me, the first law of the FBI is cover the Bureau's ass, and the second is cover your own.
That's true.
And they were not about to admit, and Hoover in particular was not about to admit, that so terrible a crime as the killing of the president could be a conspiracy and he not know about it, and the FBI not know about it. So with a bird in the hand, why beat the bushes? But they wanted to be sure that they closed all the doors so nobody could possibly prove that they were not telling the truth. Therefore, they had to close it off. And what this was the appeal from the Attorney General, Acting Attorney General, to the President to see to it that all was going to be closed off. And the way he proposed doing that is on the second page of this memorandum, where he says, where he recommends, quotes, the appointment of a presidential commission of unimpeachable personnel to review and examine the evidence and announce its conclusions. And that's what happened.
Well, this is
what I just read you is the origin of the Warren Commission.
Their actions are no different than in Nazi Germany or in communist Russia, where they violated the person's rights altogether.
It's exactly. The difference is of degree. It's a vast difference in degree, but in principle it's the same thing. And in fact, in a free country, it is in a sense even more outrageous. These are the people on whom the integrity of the government rests. These are the people on whom all of American freedoms rest. And look what they did. When the president is killed, and that's, to me, is the most subversive of possible crimes in a country like ours, they begin by making it explicit and even putting it on paper when they never expected a devil-loving scripture to see that paper, that they weren't going to investigate the crime and we're going to close it off or wipe it out. Now, bearing again, I should add on that memorandum of Mr. Katzenbach's that while I can't prove it, all the evidence is that he wrote it in longhand, and I have a copy of the longhand memorandum that he wrote, which show the corrections he made. It even indicates one word the typist couldn't make out, and he had explained that to her. That seems to have been written when there were no typists available, no secretaries available, as soon as Katzenbach learned that Oswald had been killed, and he knew there'd be no trial.
So he probably did this on a Sunday evening then?
I think so. Either that or earlier in the day. Mm-hmm. But he had to do it on Sunday because the copy was typed and then and in distribution, and there were already leaks and reactions to leaks on part of it, the part having to do with the commission, by 10 o'clock. By 10 o'clock, it had been leaked. It had reached the Washington Post, that the Washington Post had it, had come back to the FBI, and in a memorandum dated at 10:20 that I have, Deloach reports to Hoover what he had done to talk the Washington Post out of recommending editorially the creation of the Presidential Commission that Katzenbach suggested to the President. That shows you how early in the day it had to be done. So it obviously had to have been written on Sunday.
So it's not so much that people were staying up late wondering what to do. This is just what they do.
Yeah.
This is their style.
It's awful hard to, after all these years of living, it's awful hard to read it again and realize this happened in our country.
Yes.
You wonder what else happened that we have no way of knowing about.
A lot of brave men and women died for this country for a Constitution, and then to have this type of thing happen is beyond belief, isn't it?
Well, I think that what these people think about the Constitution is made clear in the records I've just read. They speak for themselves.
Yes.
Now, pardon me?
Go ahead. You had a third one, I think.
Another record. This one dated the next day, November 26th. That's Tuesday of the week after the president was killed on a Friday. And it's a report, again, going up through channels to J. Edgar Hoover from Alexander Rosen, who was then in charge of what the FBI called his General Investigative Division. And he said that the Secret Service had told the FBI that the photographs and x-rays of the president's body would be made available to us through Secret Service headquarters, Washington, D.C. What they're talking about is the president's autopsy. And under action recommended, Rosen said, it is not recommended that we request these photographs and x-rays through the Secret Service headquarters at this time, as it does not appear we should have any need for this material. What he says is this material, and by the way, this record has Hoover's approval on it, written out, OK-H. What we're talking about is what the lawyers call the corpus delicti, the body of the crime. How do you prove what the cause of death was if you don't have the autopsy? The autopsy is the most important single thing in establishing cause of death. So the FBI didn't want it. And here's why they didn't want it. When Lyndon Johnson came back to Washington the night the president was killed, as soon as he could, he called J. Edgar Hoover. My source on this, among other things, is J. Edgar Hoover's testimony before the Warren Commission, which is in Volume 5 of those hearings, and a number of FBI documents I have, including Hoover's own account of it to William Manchester. That memorandum was written by the note-taker, who was Carter Deloach. Pursuant to Johnson's directions, the FBI prepared a report that totals 5 volumes on the assassination of President Kennedy. The last volume deals with Jack Ruby. The first volume is the text of what relates to John Kennedy, and the next 3 volumes are appendix to the first volume. Now, this first volume is a beautiful thing to look at. It's carefully indexed. you won't find the things that most people are interested in the index, but boy, do they have stuff that's a diatribe against Oswald. You can't even find out in this definitive FBI report of 5 volumes what the cause of death was. It has only 2 sentences in 5 big volumes relating to the shooting. And, of course, it's all even that is done in a propagandistic way. The first sentence I'm going to read under what relates to the shooting is under the heading, Assassin in Building. That's a conclusion. That's not a statement of fact. That they hadn't yet proved it. Of course, they never really did. But the sentence reads, 2 bullets struck President Kennedy and 1 wounded Governor Connally. That accounts for the 3 bullets that officialdom of all levels say were fired, and only 3 were fired. Nobody, and the best shots in the country were gathered by the Warren Commission to try and do it. Nobody has ever been able to duplicate the shooting attributed to Oswald with that rifle. Anyway, the Warren Commission story is that the first bullet struck the president and did not kill him. The second bullet struck Governor Connally and did not kill him. And the third bullet struck President Kennedy and did kill him. But this leaves what will come to in a different form, and what everybody knew happened, that a shot had missed. This leaves the missed shot unaccounted for. The FBI does not admit that there was a missed shot, even though they transcribed for the Warren Commission the tapes of the police radio broadcast in which which is set forth in detail together with the witnesses and the name of the man who was wounded and so forth. The second reference to the shooting reads, and I read the whole thing, medical evidence of the president's body reveal. I want to note, I call to your attention and to the attention of your audience that they have refused the autopsy, so they only have a second-hand account of what the medical evidence of the president's body is. Quote again. Revealed that one of the bullets had entered just below his shoulder to the right of the spinal column at an angle of 45 to 60 degrees downward, and there was no point of exit, and that the bullet was not in the body. Now, whether or not that's true, and in fact it's not true, I've read you everything that in all 5 FBI volumes of this definitive report refers to the shooting. You will not find a reference to the cause of death. They will not find a reference to the president being wounded in the head, which is where he was killed. Now, I mentioned the missed shot. A reporter, or rather a newspaper photographer who I know, Tom Dillard, who later was chief photographer for the Dallas Morning News, was in the presidential motorcade. He jumped out of the car. He took pictures of the building that were used by the Warren Commission. And he and a fellow named Underwood, who was a photographer for TV station WFAA, also took pictures of the point on the curbstone where the missed bullet struck it. And a guy who became a friend of mine, who was a bystander, Jim Tegg, was wounded by a spray of concrete from it. And they knew all about all of this. Tegg was, in fact, a witness before the Warren Commission. In any event, when there was extensive leaking, and all of it was by the FBI, even though they pretended somebody else was doing it, and they were investigating to find out who. When the report being due in June the FBI leaked what the report would say, and it didn't account for this missed shot. And Tom Dillard was sent to cover a function at which the United States Attorney was present, and he knew him. His name is Harold Barefoot Sanders. He was known as Barefoot, and he was later an assistant attorney general in the Department of Justice. He said to Barefoot, what is this I hear about, or read in the paper about the 3 shots being fired and only 3 shots, and no shot missed? And in fact, I took a picture of where the shot that missed hit the curb. Well, Sanders couldn't ignore that. He told the Warren Commission, and they couldn't ignore that. And this is where you have the birth of what Arlen Specter invented, the bastard known as the single bullet theory. A way of accounting for the crime, including the missed bullet, and limiting it to only 3 bullets. Anyway, when the FBI was asked to look into it by the Warren Commission, the Dallas FBI sent back a report, and I go into this in the first book I wrote, saying that there was no mark there anymore, that it must have been brushed off when the street cleaning equipment was used. The FBI and nobody in Washington headquarters ever asked first whether or not you could brush off a hole in some concrete. And second, how in the world the brush would get onto the curb, onto the top of the curb if it's cleaning the streets. Anyway, nobody could buy that. So the Warren Commission asked the FBI to send somebody down from headquarters. They sent Special Agent Lyndall Schoenfeld from the Laboratory Division. He was a photographic expert. And by means of the existing pictures and the eyewitnesses, he was able to pinpoint the spot where the bullet had hit, and he took pictures of it, and then he had it dug up and took it back to Washington and took it to the laboratory for laboratory examination. Only problem was the hole had been patched. I'm telling you the literal truth. I print pictures before and after in my last book, Postmortem. I take a picture of the curbstone as it exists at the archives now, and one of Tom Dillard's pictures showing the hole, and a frame from Underwood's film showing the hole. There was a hole there, and after Oswald was arrested, somebody patched it.
They wanted to cover it up.
No, of course, no other explanation for it. No conspiracy. What this did, of course, was to make it impossible to make any kind of chemical analysis of the components of the bullet that caused the hole. You follow me?
Absolutely.
Well, the FBI went through the charade of doing just that. Schoenfeld dug it up and took it to Washington, and they did a spectrographic analysis on it. Let me read this portion of the synopsis of a 3-volume report filed on August 3rd, 1964 in Washington by Robert P. Gemmerling, the case agent of the Dallas office. Additional investigation conducted concerning mark on curb on south side of Main Street near Triple Underpass, which it is alleged was possibly caused by bullet fired during the assassination. No evidence of mark or nick on curb now. Of course, they had the best of Tom Dillard's photographs, too. The one of which he made a print for me that I used was his second best. They never returned his original photograph to him. I think this gives a fairly good indication as to what was up, but at the time of the assassination. Now, let me skip ahead a little bit until Jim Garrison's day. Jack Anderson had gone down there, and he was very impressed by some of the things Jim Garrison said. He went to the White House, and he was told at the White House he ought to take it to the FBI, and he did. He spoke to Arthur DeLoach. And this is a memorandum of April 4th, 1967, intended for Hoover, written by DeLoach through channels. I'm pretty sure it bears Hoover's initials, and I'll tell you when I skip to next to the last page to read part of it. The last page does not have Hoover's initials. It has the initials of DeLoach, who dictated it, and of Clyde Tolson, then the number 2 man and Hoover's closest friend, to whom it was sent for Hoover. Now, among other things, I won't go into all that Anderson told DeLoach that Garrison had told him. I'm going to read instead from the tail end of it, and I'm quoting. Anderson also told me that he had discussed this entire matter with George Christian. I don't need that. In this connection, Christian, by the way, was the press secretary at the White House. In this connection, Marvin Watson, who was one of Lyndon Johnson's closest assistants and advisors and had been for years, called me late last night and stated that the president had told him in an off moment that he was now convinced that there was a plot in connection with the assassination. Watson stated that the president felt that the CIA had something to do with this plot. And then that's the end of the direct quotation. And Johnson wanted any other information the FBI had. Well, here you have a man who was president of the United States. He appoints a presidential commission to look into the assassination that made him president. He finally is convinced that the commission told the country what was not the truth, saying there was no plot, and he now is convinced that there was a plot and the CIA was part of it. So what does the president, who's the most powerful man in the world and can do anything he wants to within the United States, do? He doesn't say a damn thing about it.
Why?
Well, I'm afraid Lyndon Johnson, the only one can answer that, and he's dead. But I think it's obvious that he never believed the official story all along. And, of course, he was concerned about it because it involved questions of his legitimacy.
Well, and also he realized that Kennedy had used the line of attack against the CIA, and maybe he had feared maybe approaching them. Is that a possibility?
Yes, I suppose all those things are possible. But there's one thing that's obvious, that Johnson knew that his commission had lied to the country, and he was content to let that lie endure. And what we've had here is almost a full circle of lies. We haven't paid much attention to the Warren Commission or to the multitudinous other things that I've learned in all these records I've gotten under the Freedom of Information Act, about $250,000 on the Kennedy assassination alone. From the very beginning and continuing until this very moment, the government knowingly deceived and misled the people about the assassination of the president they loved. I think that's the most subversive crime in a society like ours. The assassination itself is, and perhaps the next greatest subversion is covering it up and whitewashing it.
My question would be then, why do people like Arlen Specter and David Bellin continue in this approach? I mean, if there was nothing to hide other than they didn't care to investigate it and they were covering up that fact 25 years ago, and I can imagine them not wanting to say anything the first few days, why would this still be continuing? What would be the need after all these years? Many of these people are now dead.
I could give you many answers. That won't be time for it. Let me give you one, beginning with Arlen Specter, who is now a senator. At the time Specter joined the staff of the Warren Commission, he was an assistant district attorney of Philadelphia in a Democratic administration selected by a Democrat who was the district attorney. And Specter was a member of Americans for Democratic Action, the liberal organization. When he left the Warren Commission, he became a Republican, and the first thing he did was to exploit his Warren Commission connection to run against the man who'd gotten him a start in life and was the district attorney of Philadelphia. And with changes in the way people voted nationally, and with all of the publicity he got out of being on the Warren Commission, he defeated the man who got him a start in life. He became a Republican by defeating the man who got him a start in life. And used that to defeat the man who got him a start in life. Now, I'll give you one of many stories about David Bellin, who was so compulsive about this that he's sick. His law firm broke up over it. His partner just couldn't tolerate it anymore. And Bellin is a man who finds that if you can say something adequately in 10 words, you've got to take 10,000. One of the areas he investigated was the killing of Officer J.D. Tippett at 10th and Patton Streets. And in the course of his investigation of it, he reconstructed Oswald's path in going there from his rooming house, which, according to Bellin and the Commission's reconstruction, he left at 1:03 p.m. Dallas time. Now, I don't remember the exact time, but it was about 14 minutes later, perhaps less than that. I think it was less than that. That the shooting of Officer Tippett was on the police radio. There are the transcripts of the radio broadcast show that several unsuccessful efforts were made over a period of time, short period of time, but a period of time, to use the radio. And the dispatcher was trying to talk to the person who was trying to do it because he knew he wasn't a policeman. And then finally somebody who could use the police radio came, and that was reported. And then it was reported that Officer Tippett had been shot. The problem with all of this, and this is Bellin's part, is that his own time reconstruction showed that it took more than 17 minutes for Oswald to get there. In other words, he couldn't even get Oswald to the place of the crime in time to commit it. Bearing on this, and again Bellin had knowledge of it, 3 bullets were recovered from Tippett's body. One didn't penetrate the body, although few people know this. It hit one of the uniform buttons and was deformed and fell down. It was recovered from the ground there. 4 empty cartridge shells were recovered, and a number of witnesses say they saw the assassin deliberately throw them out of the pistol, the revolver, and reload it as he was going away. Now, the FBI, which had the best scientific lab in the world, and certainly its experts are second to none in firearms and ballistics work, they couldn't identify any one of those bullets as having been fired from the pistol taken from Oswald in the movie theater. And even that on the pistol taken from him, there isn't a chain of possession. They can't even prove it was Oswald, that Oswald had it on him. Unbelievable, but true. No marks were put on that pistol. It was just thrown in the desk drawer in the Dallas Police Headquarters and stayed there until that night when somebody thought about it. Well, no bullet could be associated with the pistol. But they had 4 shells. The bullets could be identified and were identified by the FBI by the manufacturer's name. 3 were, I may have these in reverse order, but 3 were made by Western Cartridge and 1 was made by Remington, or the other way around. However, of the 4 empty cartridge cases, 2 were made by each of those manufacturers, so even that doesn't match. I'm only talking about part of Bellin's work, and when he calls the Warren, the Tippit murder, the Rosetta Stone, what he is talking about is a millstone.
Exactly.
It's a millstone around David Bellin's neck, and he regurgitates all this nonsense, which comes down to, I am right because I say I am right, only in self-justification. He can't live with himself.
And that's the problem he's having.
Mm-hmm.
Since he called that the Rosetta Stone, and was clear evidence that Oswald not only shooting the policeman but also the president, let's put one myth to rest if we possibly can, since no one has done more research into the subject than you or read more information on it. Can we tell our audience that there is absolutely no evidence linking Oswald to either murder?
I think that's a fair interpretation of the evidence. And the reason I say that's a fair interpretation of it is because we're limited to what the FBI says it did, and we have to assume that what it says it did do. Now, let me give you an example of what it did not do. There was this bullet found when it was jarred out from underneath a mattress on a gurney in the hospital. They never tested that bullet to see if it had any human residues in it, and yet when they looked at it under the microscope, they couldn't find a microscopic mark on the bullet. The man who was in charge of this, Robert Fraser, the FBI agent, testified to the Warren Commission that if that bullet had struck coarse cloth or leather, it would have left microscopic markings, and he found none. The bullet, according to the official story, didn't strike bones in the president's body, but did strike and wreck 4 inches of Governor Connolly's 5th rib, or it may be the other way, around 5 inches of his 4th rib, came out and completely shattered his wrist, and the bones in the wrist are, of course, hard bones, and then went and lodged in his thigh. Now, you can't possibly do that without some deforming of a bullet. And all of the tests that were run trying to duplicate it, and none of them duplicated all of what was attributed to it, every single one was enormously deformed. This bullet doesn't even have a microscopic mark on it. Now, on Oswald's rifle being used and Oswald taking it into the building, 4 people saw Oswald entering the building, and all 4 said he wasn't carrying anything. Do I have to go any farther? Let me add one thing, that if a bullet had entered a human body, it picks up residues, and it's scored in being fired. You have the lands and grooves of the rifle that score the bullet to give it its twist. And they do hold residues, and the FBI never tested to see if there are any residues on the bullet. They don't even have a chain of possession on it. Nobody tried to get one.
So in a court of law, there is no evidence.
That's right. Oswald would have been acquitted if he'd gone to trial.
If he'd had a competent attorney.
A competent attorney, yes, that's right. Because the evidence points to him, but does not involve him. He could have proved he didn't carry the rifle into the building. He could have proved that bullet had not been fired during the assassination. And all sorts of other things like that.
Mr. Weisberg, there's a great deal of question, and a lot of people have dealt with this issue over the years, was that the Dallas doctors and nurses, a very competent group of people, indicated from the very moment that Charles Carrico saw the president all the way to the time Audrey Bell saw the president, that the throat wound was a wound of entrance. And even Dr. McClellan said even the head wound perhaps appeared to be a shot from the front. But then you have, according to many people, very competent pathologists in Bethesda, saying just the opposite, that these shots came from the rear. How do we reconcile this contradiction?
Well, it doesn't take as much reconciling as you think, because the competent experts who looked at it in secret in 1966 for the Department of Justice did not support the official conclusions, even though they went through the motions of saying they did. Now, I didn't anticipate you were going to ask me these questions, so I'm going to be ad-libbing from my first book. There were 6 on the Kennedy assassination and 1 on Dr. King's, and the last book, post-mortem, on the Kennedy assassination. I got from the Department of Justice the reports of this panel of experts that it had convoked in secret to look at the autopsy report and the autopsy pictures and the autopsy x-rays. Now, the Warren Commission's conclusions are based on testimony which said that the president was shot and the fleshy tissue to the right of his neck and above his shoulder bone, and that he was shot in the back of the head at the level of the occiput. That's the knob at the back of your head. And the first bullet, it said, went through his body without striking his neck. It came out through his tie and shirt collar, and then entered Governor Conley in an impossible fashion. Now, what this panel of experts said, in fact, is that the wound in the president's head was 4 inches higher than the Warren Commission said. This, of course, destroys the entire official story in and of itself. It couldn't possibly have the history attributed to it if it had not been had its point of entrance in the back of the head. This, in effect, is covering up the fact that there was a shot from the front. Now, where there was no question about the cover-up, and here you have the Honorable Senator Specter in charge of the questioning. Dr. Charles Carrico was then a young doctor, but he was the only doctor who saw President Kennedy while he still had his clothes on. And under Dr. Carrico's supervision, the nurses removed his clothing. Now, when Specter was questioning him, Specter never asked Carrico to locate the wound in the front of the president's neck. I want you to understand this now. This is a man who'd been an assistant district attorney. He was a lawyer. He's now a world-famous United States senator who poses as a man of serious and patriotic principle. His president is killed. He's in charge of this aspect of the investigation, and he doesn't even ask where the wound in the front of the president's body was. Well, Allen Dulles, who'd been head of the CIA and had been a prestigious lawyer before that, made the classic mistake of lawyers, asking one question too many. He asked Dr. Carrico to please tell him where the wound in the front of the president's neck was. And Dr. Carrico, instead of answering, made a graphic response by pointing to his own neck. And Dulles says, well, you know, the court reporter can't take the emotion down. Am I correct in saying you're pointing to above your shirt collar? And Carrico said, yes, it was above the shirt collar. And later, Dulles came back to it. He's flabbergasted. And the same thing happened. This time, of course, Carrico didn't just point. He used words. It was above the shirt collar. Now, how in the world could a bullet above the shirt collar make a hole through the tie and the shirt collar? Well, when I interviewed Dr. Carrico, he gave me a very graphic description of what happened. He said, in the emergency room, you don't have time to carefully undress people in a case like this. He said, 2 nurses under my supervision cut the necktie off. You don't have time to take it off. And you can see where the necktie's been cut. And in the course of cutting it off, they made a little nick at the upper left-hand corner of the tie as it was knotted. And while they were doing that, Carrico unbuttoned the button and put a stethoscope in the chest to see if there was any heartbeat. Isn't it interesting that you can get to be a United States Senator by not asking that question that I asked, that I, not a lawyer, asked the only witness in the world to it who was a doctor? There were 2 who were nurses. One of the nurses testified, and she said, well, we just took his clothes off in the usual manner, or the prescribed manner. Specter never asked her, what is that prescribed manner?
Seemed like the logical question to ask.
Sure.
So what would be the reasoning then for these pathologists, Hume and Boswell and Fink and Bethesda, to say the shots came from...
They knew better.
Yeah.
They took 4 inches in locating a wound on something the size of the head. Now, in post-mortem, I actually had the existing original handwritten copy of the autopsy in my hand. And it is from that I reproduced the handwritten copy in post-mortem. Every place where, I will explain that. Humes had written the autopsy report out in his own home on a Sunday morning. He was in the rec room, and there was a fire in the fireplace, and the television is on, and he heard that Oswald had just been killed. He junks the autopsy report he's written. He throws it into the fireplace. This is his own testimony. And he wrote a new one. And he took the new one back to the Navy hospital that night to the office of Admiral Galloway, where the other prosectors, one of whom was an Army Colonel Fink and the other was then a Navy Commander J. Thornton Boswell, went over it with Admiral Galloway. And Admiral Galloway wanted some changes made. One of the changes made was to eliminate the word puncture every time it appeared. I think it was about 10 times. And you can see where it's stricken through. So what we're talking about is a conscious, deliberate cover-up by responsible people in the government so that the truth about the killing of President Kennedy would never be known.
Now, 2 quick final last questions. Who do you feel killed the president and why?
I have no idea, and nobody does, except perhaps some who were involved are still alive. We can't know because the crime itself was never officially investigated. There was once a time when I thought we could approach it by asking the lawyer's question, cui bono, who benefits? But then I realized that there's so many people who could have seen benefit that you can't possibly make any identification that way. All you can do is eliminate. We have no way of knowing, and I think that anybody who tells the people that the CIA or the FBI or the Cubans or the Russians or God knows who, the Mafia, is lying to the people and knows he's lying.
Because they just really don't know.
There's no basis for knowing.
And
there is basis for eliminating, but there's no basis for knowing.
Because the evidence just doesn't exist.
Yes, and because certain circumstances eliminate certain things.
Now that we're into the time factor.
Many things, yes.
Yes.
Or who could have possessed the knowledge to set Oswald up, for one thing.
And he'd been set up for some period of several months leading up to it.
Well, there were counterfeitings of Oswald in Dallas and New Orleans. I call them in my first book the false Oswald. So clearly there was a conspiracy, and clearly the government saw to it that we never know who conspired.
And I guess the final question would be, why, after 28 years, is the government still covering this up? What would there be to gain?
I think there could be a different motive now than there was initially. I think now they just think it could be too big a shock for the people to tell the truth, and too big a shock to the institutions of government to admit the truth.
Is there any piece of evidence that you're looking for that might break this open, or do you think we've just about seen all we can see?
We may not have seen all we can see, but I don't, because there was no investigation to prove to establish guilt and to get to the root of it. There is no such paper. I'm satisfied there is no such paper. It's possible that sometime in the future we'll find that somebody who was involved had a guilty conscience and left a record of it, but I got no reason to expect it.
So as far as having hopes in the future, those are kind of dim then?
I think so. I don't think there's much prospect of it. And I think it's wrong to mislead the people on that. If it happens, we can all be happy about it. But I don't want the people to live in a false hope.
Mr. Weisberg, for people who would be interested in finding out about more information that we've been talking about today, there's evidence is replete, and information will be outlined in your many books. Could you tell our listeners how they could get a hold of those?
Yes, all they have to do is write me, and my address is 7627 Old Receiver Road. That's like receiver of stolen goods. Frederick, Maryland, and the zip code is 21702. And I'll send them a list of the books. And if they'll enclose a return address envelope, I'll appreciate it, because my wife and I are all alone, and we're both getting close to 80.
Let's also tell our listeners that you were the first. Your book was the first one on the newsstand, and it was self-printed because no one else would touch it. They were too afraid. They were too afraid to deal with it.
Yep.
And you've done the most, and you did the first. And you've also done extensive research in the Martin Luther King assassination. So for our listeners who would be interested,
one book on that.
For our listeners who'd be interested in that, you've got a great